The silent houses in the fields. They stand in silence, scattered across the endless plains of America's heartland. Old farmhouses once filled with laughter, the smells of cooking, and the hum of daily chores now stand as hollow skeletons in the middle of vast cornfields. Their windows are empty sockets, their doors swing loosely on rusted hinges, and their paint has peeled away, leaving gray wood exposed to the merciless sun and the weight of decades. These houses are no longer homes. They are monuments to abandonment, to forgotten lives, and to the slow passage of time that consumes everything man leaves behind. At first glance, they might seem picturesque, even peaceful. A solitary house surrounded by rows of corn, the golden stalks whispering in the breeze, the roof sagging but still holding. It looks like something out of a painting or an old photograph. But as you step closer, the atmosphere changes. The silence becomes oppressive. The shadows inside stretch long and strange. The wind carries not just the sound of rustling leaves, but the faint groan of a house settling into decay. You feel watched, though there is no one there. The abandoned farmhouse is not just empty, it is alive with absence. For generations, these houses represented the American dream. Built by immigrant families, sustained by hard labor, they were the center of life in rural communities. Children were born in these rooms, harvests celebrated in their kitchens, and stories told by firelight in their living rooms. To see them empty now is to feel the weight of all that has been lost. Each broken window is a memory shattered. Each creaking stair a reminder of footsteps that will never return. But there is something more here, something darker. Perhaps it is the isolation. Surrounded by miles of corn, these houses feel cut off from the world, hidden in plain sight. Cornfields themselves hold a peculiar place in the American imagination. They are beautiful, yes, vast seas of green in summer, golden waves in autumn, but they are also unsettling. Corn grows tall and dense, creating walls that block the horizon, passages that twist and turn like a maze. To enter them is to risk losing your sense of direction. To live among them is to accept that you are both protected and trapped. Abandoned farmhouses in the cornfields tap into this unease. They're the perfect stage for horror because they already feel haunted not necessarily by ghosts, but by memory, by loss, and by the suggestion that something went terribly wrong. Why would a family leave everything behind? Why are toys still scattered in the yard, or clothes still hanging in closets? Did they move on willingly, or were they driven away by forces they could not control? Economic collapse, personal tragedy, or something far stranger? Every farmhouse poses the same question, and the silence never answers. For those who dare to step inside, the details are chilling. Wallpaper peels in long strips like skin sloughing off bone. Old newspapers lie yellowed on the floor, their headlines frozen in time. Rusted bed frames sit empty, mattresses torn open by mice and weather. Sometimes there are family photographs still nailed to the walls, their faces staring out with blurred eyes, the smiles of people long gone. The effect is unsettling. It feels as though the family left suddenly, in the middle of life, and never came back. Their presence lingers, not in bodies, but in objects frozen in the moment of departure. The power of these places lies not only in their decay, but in the imagination they stir. Each visitor projects their own fears and fantasies into the silence. For some, the houses are simply relics of economic hardship, reminders of how family farms gave way to industrial agriculture. For others, they are portals into horror, settings for nightmares where the cornfields conceal not just crops but secrets. In popular culture, from horror films to urban legends, the abandoned farmhouse has become a symbol of unease, an archetype of rural fear. It is never just a house. It is a story waiting to be told, and that story begins here. In this documentary, We will explore not only the history of these farmhouses, but also the myths and horrors that surround them. We will trace their origins back to the hopeful days of settlement, examine the economic and social forces that left them empty, and listen to the legends whispered about them in nearby towns. We will walk their darkened halls, listen to their silence, and ask what they have to teach us about fear, memory, and the fragility of the American dream. The abandoned farmhouse in the cornfield is not just a ruin. It is a mirror, reflecting both history and imagination. It is a place where reality and nightmare overlap. And as we begin this journey, one thing is certain. The houses may be empty, but their stories are not. They are waiting, silent, but insistent to be told. America's heartland. To understand the tragedy of abandoned farmhouses, one must first understand the role of the American heartland. For centuries, the vast prairies and fertile plains of the Midwest have been considered the breadbasket of the United States. From Illinois and Iowa to Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, these lands produced the corn, wheat, and soybeans that fed a nation and powered its economy. Farmhouses were not merely residences, they were command centers of family labor, community identity, and cultural continuity. In the 19th century, homesteaders carved farms out of wilderness, building wooden houses that often began as single-room cabins. Over time, these humble structures expanded into two-story homes with barns, silos, and windmills. Each house told a story of resilience and determination. Families worked the land from sunrise to sunset, surviving harsh winters, droughts, and economic swings. To walk into a farmhouse was to step into the heart of rural America, a space where survival and community intertwined. The farmhouse also symbolized generational continuity. Grandparents often lived under the same roof as their children and grandchildren. Kitchens doubled as classrooms, barns as gathering spaces for church socials or dances. Life was hard, but it was anchored in a sense of belonging. The farm and its house were not just property, they were legacy. By the early 20th century, the Midwest had become a landscape of prosperity. Small towns grew around farming communities, with churches, schools, and general stores forming the social fabric. Train lines and later highways connected rural America to urban markets. Newspapers of the era spoke of bumper harvests and thriving communities. Photographs from the 1920s show proud farm families posing in front of their houses, the American dream made tangible in wood, brick, and sweat. Yet beneath this prosperity were vulnerabilities. Farming has always been at the mercy of forces beyond human control: weather, markets, and policy. A drought could devastate crops. A drop in commodity prices could erase a family's income overnight. Unlike urban workers, farmers could not simply find another job when times were hard. Their identity was tied to the land, for better or worse. The farmhouse itself reflected these cycles of fortune. In good years, families expanded, adding new rooms, porches, and decorative flourishes. In hard years, repairs were delayed, paint peeled, and roofs sagged. To look at an old farmhouse today is to see these layers of history etched into its very frame: the triumphs and the struggles, the growth and the decline. The cultural significance of the heartland also shaped national identity. Politicians spoke of the family farm as the backbone of democracy, a symbol of independence and hard work. Writers and artists romanticized the Midwest as the purest expression of American values. The farmhouse was the stage on which this ideal played out, a structure that embodied both the promise and the fragility of the American dream. By mid-century, however, cracks were beginning to show. Industrialization, urbanization, and the pressures of global markets began to undermine small farms. Younger generations left for cities, seeking education and employment beyond the confines of rural life. The houses they left behind became quieter, emptier, until eventually they stood deserted in the fields. What had once been symbols of endurance became symbols of loss. To walk through the heartland today is to feel this tension. For every thriving farm, there's another that lies in ruins. Abandoned houses that the cornfields like gravestones, reminders of a past when the land could support more families than it does today. Their presence tells us not only about economic shifts, but about the transformation of American identity itself. The American heartland was never just geography, it was mythology. The abandoned farmhouses scattered across are not simply structures in decay. They are broken chapters in the story of a nation that once defined itself through its farms, its families, and its fields. The Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. The image of the abandoned farmhouse is inseparable from the era of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. It was during this period that entire communities were uprooted, leaving behind skeletal remains of once vibrant farmsteads. The forces of economic collapse and environmental catastrophe converged to create one of the darkest chapters in rural America's history. The Great Depression began with the stock market crash of 1929, but its impact was felt most brutally in rural areas. Commodity prices for wheat, corn, and cotton plummeted, leaving farmers unable to cover the costs of seed, equipment, and mortgages. Families that had endured previous downturns suddenly found themselves drowning in debt. Banks foreclosed on properties, forcing people to abandon not only their land but the homes that had been in their families for generations. As if economic collapse were not enough, nature dealt a second blow. The Dust Bowl was the result of years of poor agricultural practices combined with severe drought. Farmers had plowed up the native grasses of the Great Plains, leaving the soil exposed and fragile. When the rains failed, the winds came. Massive dust storms swept across Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and parts of Colorado and New Mexico, turning day into night and burying homes and barns in choking layers of dirt. The air was so thick with dust that children wore masks to school and families sealed their windows with wet rags. Yet even these efforts often failed. Dust crept into every corner, suffocating both crops and spirits. The human toll was immense. Families watched as their farms literally blew away. Livestock starved or suffocated, crops failed year after year, and water grew scarce. With no means to survive, hundreds of thousands of people packed their belongings into battered trucks and fled westward. They became known as Okies, a term that carried stigma but also spoke to their desperation. For many, the farmhouse they left behind was not just a building, it was the grave of their past life. Writers and photographers immortalized the devastation. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath told the story of the Joad family, forced from their Oklahoma farm to seek work in California. Dorothea Lange's haunting photographs captured mothers and children standing before dilapidated farmhouses, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair. These images became emblems of the era, reminders of how fragile the American dream could be when confronted by forces beyond human control. Walking through an abandoned farmhouse from this period today is like stepping into a time capsule of the 1930s. Peeling wallpaper and rusted stoves tell of daily life interrupted. Newspapers left behind carry headlines of economic collapse. Family portraits lie cracked and faded, reminders of those who once endured here. The silence is heavy, filled with the echoes of hardship and resilience. These houses were not simply deserted, they were surrendered to inevitability. The legacy of the Dust Bowl still lingers. Some of the abandoned houses from that era remain standing, their frames warped and weathered, surrounded by empty fields where corn or wheat once grew. They serve as stark reminders of both environmental fragility and human endurance. Lessons learned from that time about soil conservation, crop rotation, and government support changed American agriculture forever. Yet the physical scars remain in the form of ruined homesteads that the prairies. In the broader narrative of abandoned farmhouses, the Great Depression and Dust Bowl stand as a turning point. They transformed the landscape of rural America, emptying towns, scattering families, and embedding the image of the farmhouse as both a victim and a witness of catastrophe. Every cracked wall and collapsed roof from this era whispers the same message. Survival was not guaranteed, and sometimes the land itself turned against those who try to tame it. The rise and fall of family farms. The story of abandoned farmhouses cannot be told without exploring the rise and fall of family farms in the United States. These farms were once the backbone of American society, sustaining generations with food, stability, and a sense of purpose. Yet by the late 20th century, many of them had vanished, leaving behind only hollow shells of houses where families once thrived. The rise of family farms began in earnest during the 19th century, when westward expansion and the Homestead Act of 1862 encouraged settlers to claim land and build their lives upon it. These early farmers carved homes out of wilderness, establishing communities that defined the American Midwest and Great Plains. For decades, these farms embodied the ideal of self-sufficiency. Families grew their own food, raised livestock, and sold surplus crops to local markets. The farmhouse was the beating heart of this life, a symbol of endurance, community, and continuity. By the early 20th century, technological innovation had begun to transform farming. Tractors replaced horses, mechanized harvesters increased efficiency, and new fertilizers boosted crop yields. At first, these changes brought prosperity. Families could work larger plots of land, produce more food, and support thriving rural economies. Small towns bustled with activity as farmers came to trade, worship, and celebrate. Photographs from the 1920s and 30s depict proud families standing before sturdy homes, the fruits of labor visible in the barns and silos behind them. But prosperity carried hidden costs. Mechanization required capital investment. Families who could not afford the latest machines fell behind. Banks became more involved in farm financing, and debt began to weigh heavily on rural households. Economic downturns like the Great Depression exposed these vulnerabilities, and while some families recovered, others never did. The post-World War II era marked both a golden age and the beginning of the end for family farms. Government policies promoted efficiency and scale, favoring larger operations that could produce more food at lower costs. The rise of agribusiness meant that small farms were increasingly absorbed into larger enterprises. Families who had farmed for generations faced difficult choices: sell out, adapt, or be driven under by competition. For many, the stress was overwhelming. Margins grew thinner, debts deeper, and younger generations less inclined to inherit the struggles of farm life. Cities offered education, jobs, and opportunities unavailable in rural towns. As children left, farmhouses grew quieter. Bedrooms that once housed bustling families became empty, gathering dust. Kitchens once filled with the clatter of meals turned into silent spaces of memory. By the 1970s and 80s, the decline of family farms reached crisis levels. Falling crop prices, rising costs, and a wave of foreclosures devastated rural America. News reports from the era showed farmers weeping as banks repossessed land that had been in families for over a century. Communities fractured, and the houses that once stood as symbols of resilience became monuments of defeat. Walking through one of these abandoned homes today is to see the personal toll of these broader economic forces. A child's toy left in a corner, a pair of work boots by the door, or family photos curling in broken frames all tell stories of lives interrupted. These are not ruins born of war or disaster, but of systemic change. A nation shifting from small-scale farming to industrial agriculture, from family to corporation. The fall of family farms also reshaped the American imagination. Where once the farmer was celebrated as the backbone of democracy, By the late 20th century, he had become a tragic figure, displaced by machines, markets, and modernity. Writers, filmmakers, and musicians mourned the loss, portraying the abandoned farmhouse as both symbol and setting for stories of loss, resilience, and sometimes horror. In this context, the abandoned farmhouse is not only a physical ruin, but also a cultural one. It reflects the disappearance of a way of life that once defined the nation. The rise and fall of family farms remind us that progress is not always linear, and that every gain carries its own form of loss. Anatomy of an abandoned farmhouse. Step inside an abandoned farmhouse, and the first impression is almost always the same: a sense of intrusion. It feels as though the walls themselves know you do not belong. The air is heavy, stale, and tinged with dust, a cocktail of mildew and memory. Sunlight filters weakly through broken panes of glass, casting fragmented shadows on warped floorboards. Everything is familiar, yet wrong domestic space stripped of domesticity, leaving behind a stage set for unease. The anatomy of an abandoned farmhouse tells the story of its former inhabitants in fragments. The kitchen, once the heart of the home, often still contains rusted stoves, chipped enamel sinks, and cupboards filled with jars whose contents long ago turned to dust. It is here, in these details, that the rhythm of daily life is most palpable. A child's cereal bowl, left on the table, now fossilized in grime. A calendar on the wall, forever frozen on a date decades past. These objects speak louder than words, whispering of mornings, meals, and routines that ended abruptly. Bedrooms tell a different story. Beds stripped of mattresses, frames rusting, or sometimes sagging under the weight of decay. Closets hang half open, coats and dresses yellowed with age, moth-eaten and crumbling at the seams. Shoes left behind suggest hurried departures, while empty dressers imply more deliberate abandonment. The intimacy of these spaces, once private, now exposed, gives visitors the unsettling sense of trespassing into the remnants of another life. Living rooms are strange theaters of absence. Sofas slump under decades of neglect, fabric shredded by animals or collapsed under their own weight. Televisions, bulky and obsolete, sit dark and silent, their screens cracked like blinded eyes. Mantelpieces sometimes still display family photos, faces blurred by time, yet unmistakably human. These fragments remind us that lives unfolded here: conversations, arguments, celebrations, sorrows all gone, leaving behind only mute evidence. Even the smallest details contribute to the anatomy of abandonment. Wallpaper peeling in sheets, sometimes revealing older patterns beneath a palimpsest of taste across generations. Floorboards bowed with moisture, creaking ominously under the weight of explorers. Doors that no longer close, hinges rusted, locks useless. Broken windows let in the elements so that snow drifts onto the floor in winter and weeds creep inside during summer. Nature itself participates in the reclamation, slowly erasing the boundary between house and field. The barns and outbuildings surrounding the farmhouse add another layer. Here lie rusted tractors, tools left scattered as if awaiting a hand that never returned, bales of hay turned to dust. These structures echo the same theme: interrupted labor, work unfinished. They remind us that the farmhouse was not an isolated domestic sphere, but part of a larger ecosystem of survival. Explorers often describe the uncanny feeling of time standing still in such houses. Unlike ruins of ancient castles or temples, abandoned farmhouses retain a closeness to living memory. They are not relics of a distant past, but of parents, grandparents, neighbors. To step into one is to bridge a gap between the present and a not-so-distant life that could have been one's own. This immediacy makes the encounter both haunting and intimate. There's also danger in these spaces, both physical and psychological. Floors may give way, ceilings collapse. Animals, insects, and mold make these houses hazardous to explore. Yet the greater danger is often the way the mind fills silence with stories. Every object suggests a narrative. Why was this left behind? Who was the last to touch it? Did they leave by choice or by force of circumstances darker than economics? The ambiguity breeds unease. Ultimately, the anatomy of an abandoned farmhouse is a study in paradox. It is empty, yet full of presence. It is silent, yet it speaks volumes. It is past, yet it lingers in the present. Each room is an unfinished sentence, each object a clue in a mystery that can never fully be solved. And it is in this incompleteness that the power of the abandoned farmhouse truly lies. It draws us in not to answer questions, but to remind us that absence itself can be as compelling and as terrifying as presence. Cornfield horrors. Cornfields are at once beautiful and unsettling, vast seas of green and gold that define the American Midwest. They stretch for miles, their uniform rows creating hypnotic patterns, their stalks whispering in the wind like voices. To many, they symbolize prosperity and abundance, the heart of America's agricultural might. Yet in the cultural imagination, cornfields carry another meaning. They are places of concealment, of disorientation, of fear. They are perfect landscapes for horror, and when combined with the silent presence of abandoned farmhouses, they become stages for nightmares. The physical qualities of cornfields explain much of their power. Corn grows tall and dense, often over 6 feet high, forming walls that block vision and sound. To step into a cornfield is to lose sight of the horizon, to enter a world where every direction looks the same. Paths twist, rows seem endless, and disorientation sets in quickly. Even in daylight, there is a claustrophobic quality. At night, the effect is magnified. The stalks rustle with unseen movement, shadows shift with the moonlight, and the darkness seems alive. Writers and filmmakers have long recognized this uncanny quality. Stephen King's short story Children of the Corn and the films it inspired turned cornfields into sites of ritualistic terror. Night Shyamalan signs used them to conceal alien intruders. The ordinary landscape transformed into something menacing. Countless low-budget horror films rely on the trope of the endless corn maze where victims are hunted. These cultural references reinforce the idea that cornfields are not merely crops, they are labyrinths, prisons, or even predators in their own right. When an abandoned farmhouse stands amid these fields, the effect is doubled. The house represents absence, while the cornfield represents concealment. Together, they create an environment where imagination runs wild. A traveler passing such a scene might wonder, who lived here and why did they leave? Are they truly gone, or are they still here, hidden in the fields? The rows of corn seem to hold secrets, and the farmhouse feels like a witness unwilling to speak. There are also historical and psychological reasons for this unease. Farming communities often relied on isolation, with homes miles apart. In such settings, fear of the unknown grew easily. A creak in the house or movement in the fields at night could be an animal or something else. Oral traditions in rural America are filled with tales of figures seen in cornfields, strangers appearing without warning, or voices carried on the wind. These stories reflect both real, dangerous trespassers, criminals, or accidents, and the anxieties of living in vast, empty spaces where help was far away. Cornfields also represent cycles of life and death. Planted in spring, they grow tall in summer, are harvested in fall, and then vanish, leaving bare fields behind. The sight of an abandoned farmhouse, surrounded by corn, ties the decay of human life to the relentless rhythm of agriculture. The crops grow, the families fade, and the land endures. In this way, cornfields are both sustenance and graveyard, feeding bodies while haunting minds. For explorers and storytellers, the combination of farmhouse and cornfield is irresistible. Photographers frame images of houses nearly swallowed by stalks, roofs barely visible above the green. Filmmakers set scenes of terror in the narrow rows, where visibility drops to nothing and sound plays tricks. Paranormal enthusiasts claim that the fields amplify spiritual energy, that ghosts move more freely there. Whether one believes in the supernatural or not, the psychological impact of standing alone in a cornfield beside an empty house is undeniable. It is a confrontation with both nature's power and human fragility. In the mythology of rural horror, cornfields are more than scenery, they are characters. They hide, they whisper, they close in around the unwary. They are the perfect accomplices to the abandoned farmhouse, together creating landscapes where fear feels natural. To speak of cornfield horrors is not simply to invoke a genre of fiction. It is to acknowledge the real, deep-rooted unease these places inspire. They are reminders that in the heart of America's abundance lies a shadow, where the line between safety and terror grows thin. Tales of families that vanished. Among the many mysteries that swirl around abandoned farmhouses, none are more haunting than the tales of families that seem to vanish without a trace. These stories, sometimes rooted in fact, sometimes in folklore, add an unsettling dimension to the silent ruins scattered across America's cornfields. They transform mere structures of wood and stone into enigmas, drawing visitors into speculation about what might have happened within those walls. In rural communities, sudden departures were not uncommon. Economic hardship, foreclosure, or illness could force families to leave almost overnight. But when belongings were left behind, furniture, clothing, even food on the table, neighbors often whispered of darker possibilities. Did tragedy strike? Were they victims of violence? Or did they flee from something unseen? One frequently told story centers on a farmhouse in Iowa where, according to locals, a family of 5 disappeared in the 1950s. When relatives came to check, they found the house in disarray. Dishes on the table, beds unmade, and the family's car still in the barn. No bodies were ever discovered, no official report filed, but the tale persisted in local lore. Urban explorers who visit the site today describe an eerie sense of presence, as though the family never truly left. Similar legends exist in Kansas and Nebraska, where abandoned houses bear the marks of lives abruptly interrupted. In one case, farmers reported seeing lights in the windows of a deserted home long after it was supposedly empty. Another story tells of a family that supposedly fled in the night, leaving their possessions but taking nothing else. Some say they were running from debt collectors, others from something more sinister. While many of these stories cannot be verified, their persistence reveals something about the psychology of rural abandonment. When a home stands empty, its silence invites explanation. Humans are natural storytellers, filling gaps in knowledge with narratives that reflect their fears and anxieties. In tight-knit rural communities, the sudden disappearance of neighbors was so unsettling that only extraordinary explanations seem sufficient. It is also true that isolated farmhouses have been sites of real tragedies. Crimes, accidents, and suicides occurred far from the eyes of towns and law enforcement. Newspapers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries contain reports of families found dead in their homes from carbon monoxide poisoning, fires, or outbreaks of disease. Sometimes only vague records remain, but in communities where memory outlives fact, these tragedies evolve into legends of vanishing families. The tales often emphasize the uncanny detail of lives interrupted midstream. A book left open on a table, a rocking chair still moving, a meal unfinished. These details are compelling because they suggest not just departure, but rupture. Something came between daily life and its continuation, leaving a scar in the form of an abandoned home. Folklorists note that these legends often resemble ghost stories, serving as cautionary tales about fragility, isolation, and the limits of human control. The disappearing family embodies the fear that stability can collapse in an instant. To the neighbors left behind, the abandoned farmhouse was a reminder of their own vulnerability. Urban explorers today contribute to the preservation of these stories, intentionally or not. Photographs of empty bedrooms, dusty toys, and forgotten possessions circulate online, accompanied by captions that speculate about the fates of the families. Whether or not the legends are true, the imagery feeds the same sense of unease. A farmhouse without its family becomes not just a ruin, but a riddle. Ultimately, the power of these tales lies not in their factual accuracy, but in their symbolic resonance. They speak to a deeper truth, that life in rural America has always been precarious. Economic downturns, environmental disasters, and personal tragedies could all sweep families away without warning. The stories of vanished families encapsulate this fragility, using mystery as a way to grapple with the incomprehensible. Every abandoned farmhouse whispers such questions. Who lived here? Why did they leave? And why does it feel as though they never fully departed? The answers may never come, but the stories endure, making the empty houses not only relics of history, but monuments to the enduring human need to explain the unexplainable. The urban explorers. In recent decades, abandoned farmhouses have found new life not as homes, but as destinations for a growing subculture of urban explorers. These individuals, often armed with cameras and flashlights, venture into forgotten spaces to document, experience, and sometimes romanticize the aesthetics of decay. While their activities raise ethical and safety questions, they have also helped bring attention to the eerie beauty and cultural significance of abandoned rural America. Urban exploration, or urbex, is usually associated with decaying factories, derelict hospitals, and forgotten cityscapes. But the countryside offers its own rich terrain. Farmhouses in the Midwest and Great Plains, often left untouched for decades, present explorers with intimate glimpses into lives interrupted. Unlike industrial ruins, these homes contain personal relics, family photographs, children's toys, clothing that create a powerful sense of connection across time. For many explorers, the draw lies in the tension between beauty and fear. Sunlight slanting through broken shutters, dust motes dancing in the air, and vines crawling across door frames create scenes that are simultaneously picturesque and unsettling. The aesthetic of ruin porn, as critics call it, thrives on these contrasts. An abandoned farmhouse is not merely a shell, it is a canvas where nature, neglect, and memory combine to produce haunting imagery. Social media has amplified this fascination. Instagram accounts, YouTube channels, and photography blogs feature endless tours through crumbling farmhouses. Some explorers treat their work as art, carefully framing shots that highlight the textures of peeling wallpaper or the quiet melancholy of forgotten possessions. Others emphasize the thrill of danger, narrating their adventures through creaking floors, collapsing roofs, and encounters with wildlife or occasionally hostile property owners. There's an ethical dimension to this activity. Many explorers follow a code. Take nothing but photographs, leave nothing but footprints. Yet not all adhere to it. Looting, vandalism, and reckless trespassing have tarnished the reputation of urbex. In rural communities, where abandoned properties may still carry emotional significance for descendants, the presence of strangers can feel invasive. What to one person is a playground of decay may to another be a graveyard of memories. Nevertheless, urban explorers have undeniably contributed to preserving the legacy of abandoned farmhouses. By photographing and sharing their finds, They create visual archives of structures that may soon collapse entirely. These images circulate far beyond the regions where the houses stand, introducing global audiences to the forgotten corners of America. In this way, the farmhouse is transformed from a local ruin into a symbol of broader cultural and historical processes. Explorers often describe their experiences in near-spiritual terms. To enter an abandoned farmhouse is, for some, to step outside of ordinary time. The silence, the artifacts, the sense of intrusion all combine to produce heightened awareness. Each creak of the floor, each gust of wind through broken windows, feels loaded with meaning. For some, it is a way of communing with the past. For others, it is simply a rush of adrenaline. Either way, the experience leaves an impression that lingers. The risks are real. Structural collapse, asbestos, mold, and wild animals pose physical dangers. Trespassing laws create legal ones. Yet the allure persists, and for many explorers, the dangers are part of the appeal. To walk into an abandoned farmhouse is to test boundaries between safety and risk, legality and defiance, presence and absence. Ultimately, urban exploration of farmhouses underscores a paradox. These houses, once private sanctuaries of family life, become public spectacles in decay. Their stories are retold not by descendants, but by strangers with cameras. In this transformation, something is lost, but something is also gained. The farmhouse, once forgotten, becomes part of a living conversation about memory, mortality, and the aesthetics of ruin. In the end, the urban explorers do more than document decay. They remind us that even in abandonment, these houses continue to matter. They inspire, unsettle, and provoke questions that linger long after the explorers have left. The houses may be empty, but through the lens of urbex, they speak again quietly, hauntingly, and insistently. Paranormal associations. The abandoned farmhouse is not just a ruin, it is often seen as a haunted place. Rural folklore is rich with tales of strange sounds, ghostly apparitions, and unexplained phenomena tied to these empty homes. Whether one believes in the supernatural or not, the aura of these houses makes them fertile ground for paranormal associations. Visitors frequently report unusual sensations when entering such places. A sudden drop in temperature, the feeling of being watched, or the sound of footsteps echoing in empty rooms. Some describe hearing whispers carried on the wind through broken windows, or doors slamming despite the stillness of the air. These experiences can often be explained by drafts, animals, or the power of suggestion, but in the moment, they feel very real. Local legends abound. In some towns, specific farmhouses are said to be cursed. Stories tell of families who suffered misfortune, disease, accidents, or mysterious deaths until they finally abandoned their homes. The houses, left to rot, became symbols of bad luck. Children dared each other to approach, and adults avoided them altogether. Over time, the stories grew, transforming ordinary decay into supernatural menace. Paranormal investigators have also taken interest. Ghost hunting groups visit abandoned farmhouses with cameras, recorders, and electromagnetic detectors, hoping to capture evidence of spirits. Some claim to have recorded disembodied voices, pleas, warnings, or cries of anguish. Others report photographs with strange orbs of light or shadows that could not be explained. While skeptics dismiss much of this as coincidence or illusion, the persistence of such reports keeps the stories alive. The isolation of these houses adds to their mystique. Unlike urban ruins, which are often surrounded by bustling life, rural farmhouses stand alone in vast fields. At night, the darkness is total, the silence profound. A single creak of wood or rustle in the corn can trigger primal fears. It is easy to imagine that the house is inhabited not by people, but by echoes of its past. Psychologists suggest that these feelings are rooted in human responses to abandonment. Empty houses are uncanny, they look like homes, but they no longer serve their purpose. This contradiction unsettles us. Our minds project presence into absence, filling the silence with imagined voices. In rural cultures, where oral traditions pass stories from generation to generation, such experiences quickly become enshrined as ghost tales. Popular culture has reinforced these associations. Horror films frequently use farmhouses as haunted settings, drawing on the existing unease people feel in such spaces. From films like the Amityville Horror to countless low-budget ghost stories, the trope of the haunted farmhouse is now firmly entrenched in the American imagination. The cornfields outside, dark and rustling, only heighten the effect. For urban explorers and paranormal enthusiasts alike, the draw is irresistible. They enter these spaces not only to document decay, but to test the boundary between natural and supernatural. Whether or not they find evidence of spirits, they find stories, and those stories continue to spread, ensuring that the farmhouse lives on as more than wood and nails. It becomes a nexus of fear, memory, and imagination. Ultimately, whether one believes in ghosts or not is almost beside the point. The power of the abandoned farmhouse lies in its ability to provoke. Its silence invites stories, its decay suggests tragedy, and its isolation amplifies every creak and shadow. In this sense, the paranormal associations are not just about spirits, but about user need to explain the unexplainable, our desire to find meaning in emptiness, and our fear of what lingers when life departs. The haunted farmhouse is a mirror for the human psyche. It reflects our anxieties about loss, isolation, and mortality. And as long as these houses stand, their windows dark and their fields whispering, they will continue to be seen not just as ruins, but as thresholds to something beyond. The cornfield as a stage of fear. Cornfields hold a unique place in the American psyche. To some, they symbolize abundance, growth, and the agricultural heritage of the Midwest. To others, they're claustrophobic landscapes of fear, where direction is lost and the familiar becomes strange. When paired with abandoned farmhouses, these fields transform into stages where both history and horror play out, blending the real with the imagined. The sheer scale of cornfields is one source of their unease. Stretching for miles in every direction, they form natural walls that trap sound and obscure vision. Unlike forests, which offer varied terrain, cornfields are uniform. Each row looks like the next, creating an endless maze. To step into one is to surrender your bearings. Even experienced farmers acknowledge that without a clear path or the sun as a guide, it is easy to become disoriented. For the uninitiated, fear sets in quickly. At night, this disorientation turns to dread. The tall stalks move with the wind, producing sounds that mimic whispers or footsteps. Shadows flicker in moonlight, giving the impression of figures just out of sight. Many who have walked through fields after dark describe a visceral sense of being followed. Rationally, they know it is only the wind and wildlife. Emotionally, it feels like something else. The cornfield becomes a stage, and the imagination provides the actors. This quality has made cornfields a recurring backdrop in American horror. Stephen King's Children of the Corn transformed them into sites of cultish violence. Films like Jeepers Creepers 2 and Signs used them as places of ambush and concealment. Even outside of horror, corn mazes at autumn festivals tap into the same psychology. The thrill of being lost, the relief of escape. Cornfields embody the tension between order and chaos. Their neat rows concealing unpredictable dangers. When an abandoned farmhouse sits on the edge of such a field, the symbolism intensifies. The house represents absence, desertion, and decay. The cornfield represents concealment and uncertainty. Together, They form a landscape that feels charged with meaning, as though something terrible has already happened or is about to happen. The farmhouse becomes a witness, the field a curtain behind which unseen forces lurk. Folklore from rural communities often reinforces this perception. Tales of figures glimpsed between the rows, of voices calling from the fields, or of lights seen moving through the stalks are common. Some stories serve as cautionary tales, warning children not to wander too far. Others are framed as supernatural encounters, evidence of spirits or entities tied to the land. Whether believed or not, these stories shape the way people experience the landscape, layering it with unease. Psychologists argue that the fear of cornfields is rooted in basic human instincts. We fear places where visibility is low, where movement is restricted, and where escape is uncertain. Cornfields combine all three. They also disrupt our sense of scale. Something could be 10 feet away or 100, and we would not know until it emerges. This ambiguity keeps the nervous system on high alert, primed for danger. Yet fear is not the only response. For some, cornfields are thrilling precisely because they evoke these emotions. Haunted attractions and horror films use them deliberately, tapping into the cultural associations of dread. The setting does half the work. Place someone in a cornfield at night, and they will likely feel fear without needing a ghost or monster. The landscape itself is enough. In this way, the cornfield becomes more than just farmland. It is a psychological space, a symbol, and a stage for stories. When paired with an abandoned farmhouse, it becomes iconic, an image that resonates across culture, from local folklore to Hollywood cinema. The corn whispers, the house looms, and together they ask the questions we fear to answer. What hides in the rows? Who lived here, and why did they leave? And why, in their absence, does it feel like something still remains? Ultimately, the cornfield as a stage of fear reminds us that landscapes are never neutral. They carry the weight of memory, culture, and imagination. To walk among the rows beside an empty house is to confront not only the unknown outside, but the fears within ourselves. It is to enter a space where the ordinary becomes uncanny, and where every rustle in the dark might be something waiting to emerge. Rural crime stories. While folklore and paranormal tales dominate much of the lore surrounding abandoned farmhouses, the reality is that many of these homes have witnessed real-world crimes and tragedies. In the isolation of rural America, where neighbors may be miles away and law enforcement slow to respond, farmhouses sometimes became the stage for violence, desperation, and mystery. These stories, rooted in fact, amplify the unsettling aura of abandoned homes. Historical newspapers are filled with grim accounts. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cases of family annihilations where entire households were murdered occasionally shocked rural communities. Isolated locations made such crimes easier to commit and harder to detect. One infamous case is the Villisca Axe murders of 1912 in Iowa, where 8 people were killed in a small farmhouse. Though not technically abandoned at the time, the house became a symbol of terror, standing empty for years and later drawing paranormal investigators. Its story illustrates how crime can turn an ordinary farmhouse into a lasting monument of fear. Smaller but no less tragic cases also abound. Reports describe farmers killed in disputes over land or inheritance, robberies gone wrong, and domestic violence hidden from public view. In communities where privacy was valued and isolation was the norm, such incidents sometimes went unreported or unresolved. When families fled or houses were left behind, the stories clung to the empty structures, adding layers of rumor and dread. During the Great Depression, desperation fueled crime in rural areas. Bandits targeted farmhouses, knowing that cash, food, and weapons were often kept inside. Families sometimes vanished under suspicious circumstances, their disappearance explained away by foreclosure or migration, but whispered about as possible foul play. In truth, the line between economic tragedy and criminal act was often blurred. The isolation of farmhouses also made them ideal hideouts. Outlaws on the run, from petty thieves to notorious criminals, occasionally squatted in abandoned homes. Some were caught after neighbors reported strange lights or movements in supposedly empty buildings. Others simply vanished into the rural landscape, leaving behind rumors that they had died or been killed within the farmhouse walls. To this day, explorers sometimes find evidence-spent cartridges, graffiti, or makeshift bedding suggesting that abandoned farmhouses continue to serve as temporary shelters for the desperate. There are also darker legends of serial killers or drifters preying on isolated families. While many such stories are exaggerated, they reflect genuine fears of rural vulnerability. Without nearby witnesses or quick police response, farmhouses were inherently at risk. Even today, true crime enthusiasts and investigators revisit cold cases tied to rural homes, noting how their seclusion both concealed and revealed human cruelty. Beyond violent crime, farmhouses were sometimes associated with illicit activities. During Prohibition, some became sites for bootlegging or hidden stills. In later decades, drug manufacturing operations were occasionally discovered in abandoned rural homes. These uses, though far removed from the original lives of the families who built them, further contributed to the aura of danger and secrecy. The stories of rural crime tied to farmhouses endure because they highlight a stark truth. Isolation breeds both independence and vulnerability. Families cherish the privacy of their land, but that same privacy could conceal unspeakable acts. When the houses were later abandoned, the memories of these events lingered, merging fact with rumor until the two became inseparable. Today, when explorers or passers-by encounter an abandoned farmhouse, they're often struck by a sense of unease that goes beyond decay. It is as though the walls themselves hold memory of what occurred. Whether crime, tragedy, or simple misfortune, the stories are never far behind. And it is these stories, real, documented, and undeniable, that make rural crime an essential part of the haunting narrative of abandoned farmhouses. Decay and nature's reclaim. Time is the most relentless force acting on abandoned farmhouses, and nature is its most patient accomplice. Left untended, these once proud homes begin to wither, surrendering inch by inch to the elements. Roofs sag and collapse, floorboards rot, and walls buckle under the steady weight of neglect. Yet there is a strange beauty in this process of decay. It is not merely destruction, it is transformation, as nature reclaims what was once borrowed. The first signs of reclamation often appear in subtle ways. Moss creeps across shingles, vines crawl up siding, and weeds sprout in the cracks of porches. Birds nest in attics, raccoons prowl through kitchens, and insects establish colonies in every crevice. As seasons pass, the line between house and landscape blurs. A farmhouse left empty long enough ceases to look like a structure imposed on the land and begins to resemble an outgrowth of it. Weather plays its role mercilessly. Rain seeps through broken windows, soaking wallpaper until it sloughs off in ribbons. Snow drifts through holes in the roof, melting into puddles that warp wooden floors. In summer, heat bakes the walls, cracking paint and warping beams. Each year accelerates the process, and without repairs, the decline is irreversible. In the span of a few decades, a sturdy farmhouse can become little more than a skeleton of wood and stone. Yet decay also reveals layers of history. As walls crumble, older wallpaper patterns emerge, showing the tastes of previous generations. Floorboards worn smooth by footsteps give way to the earth below, exposing foundations laid by hands long gone. Even collapsed barns and rusted tractors tell a story not just of neglect, but of endurance, of objects holding on as long as they can against time. Nature's reclaim is not only physical, but symbolic. To see corn sprouting through the cracks of a kitchen floor or a tree growing inside a living room is to witness the cycle of life overtaking human absence. These sights evoke awe and melancholy in equal measure. They remind us that human control over the land is always temporary, that ownership is fleeting, and that in the end, the earth takes back what is hers. For explorers and photographers, this stage of decay holds particular fascination. The juxtaposition of human artifacts and natural intrusion creates powerful imagery. A piano covered in ivy, a bathtub filled with rainwater and leaves, a door frame warped by tree roots. Each scene tells a story of time's passage. These images circulate widely, feeding the cultural fascination with ruins and the aesthetic of abandonment. But for descendants of the families who once lived there, the process can be painful to witness. A home that once represented heritage and continuity becomes unrecognizable. What was once a place of gathering is reduced to rubble. This transformation mirrors broader social shifts: the decline of family farms, the migration to cities, and the fading of rural communities. The physical collapse of the farmhouse is a metaphor for the collapse of a way of life. Still, some see hope in reclamation. Environmentalists note that abandoned farmhouses and their surrounding lands often become havens for wildlife. Birds, foxes, and insects thrive in the absence of human activity. Fields revert to prairie, and forests creep back into farmland. What humans see as ruin, nature sees as opportunity. In this way, decay is not an end, but a transition. In the grand arc of time, human structures are temporary. The abandoned farmhouse is a reminder of this truth. Its decay is not failure, but inevitability. To watch nature reclaim, it is to be reminded of our place in the cycle of creation and erosion. These houses, though empty, still serve a purpose. They teach us humility, showing that no matter how strong our walls, the earth will always outlast us. Ultimately, the decay of abandoned farmhouses is both tragic and poetic. They stand as elegies to forgotten families and as testaments to the resilience of nature. Their collapse is not erasure, but transformation, a reminder that even in abandonment, there is continuity, and even in ruin, there is life. Pop culture and farmhouse horror. The image of the abandoned farmhouse has seeped deep into popular culture, becoming one of the most recognizable tropes in American horror and rural Gothic storytelling. Its boarded windows, collapsing porches, and isolation amid fields have been reimagined in countless films, novels, video games, and even music. What was once a practical structure built for survival has transformed into an icon of dread and fascination. Hollywood, in particular, has embraced the farmhouse as a stage for horror. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, cemented the trope, presenting a rural home filled with terror and brutality. The film's success inspired generations of storytellers to use similar settings: isolated, decaying houses that conceal dark secrets. Later films like the Amityville Horror, House of 1,000 Corpses, and The Conjuring drew on the same imagery, reinforcing the farmhouse's shorthand for haunted or malevolent spaces. Stephen King, master of rural horror, repeatedly turned to farmhouses and fields as backdrops for his stories. In Children of the Corn, abandoned homes dotting endless cornfields become symbols of both loss and lurking menace. In Star 1922 Star, a farmhouse is not only the site of murder, but also a character in itself, decaying in parallel with the protagonist's sanity. These narratives demonstrate how the farmhouse functions as more than a building. It is a vessel for psychological and supernatural fear. Beyond horror, the abandoned farmhouse also appears in music and art. Country and folk musicians have long sung of deserted homes as metaphors for loss and nostalgia. Bruce Springsteen, for example, often referenced the decay of rural America in his lyrics, painting portraits of places where the American dream faltered. Photographers have built entire careers capturing the melancholic beauty of farmhouses collapsing into fields, their images displayed in galleries and shared widely online. Video games, too, have adopted the trope. Survival horror titles often feature abandoned rural homes as introductory settings, teaching players to fear what lurks inside. The creaking floors, flickering lights, and ominous silence are instantly familiar to audiences primed by decades of cultural storytelling. Games like Resident Evil 7, Biohazard lean heavily on farmhouse imagery, immersing players in environments that feel both intimate and terrifying. Part of the appeal lies in the farmhouse's dual identity. On one hand, it represents nostalgia, a connection to family heritage and simpler times. On the other, it embodies abandonment, decay, and the uncanny. This tension allows creators to use it flexibly, as a symbol of both longing and fear. A photograph of an empty house in the fields can evoke either sadness or dread, depending on the context. The farmhouse's role in pop culture also reflects broader anxieties about rural decline. As family farms disappeared and small towns emptied, abandoned homes became visible markers of change. Storytellers seized on these markers to explore themes of alienation, economic hardship, and cultural loss. Horror simply amplified these themes, turning the quiet tragedy of abandonment into spectacle. Interestingly, the farmhouse has also become a site of parody and pastiche. Films and television shows sometimes exaggerate its cliched status, using it knowingly as a symbol of impending doom. Halloween attractions build replicas of decrepit farmhouses to capitalize on their cultural resonance. Even commercials occasionally employ the imagery, relying on audiences' familiarity with the trope to evoke emotion quickly. What this all demonstrates is that the abandoned farmhouse is no longer just a physical place, it is a cultural construct. Its meaning has expanded far beyond the rural Midwest. It exists simultaneously in real landscapes and in the shared imagination of audiences worldwide. Every time we see one on screen or hear it in a song, we are tapping into a reservoir of associations built over decades of storytelling. Ultimately, the farmhouse endures in pop culture because it bridges two powerful themes: the intimacy of home and the terror of its loss. We fear not just the monsters that may lurk inside, but the emptiness itself, the reminder that homes, like lives, can be abandoned. This resonance ensures that as long as stories are told, the abandoned farmhouse will remain a fixture, both on the American landscape and in the global imagination. Modern ghost town farms. Across the rural Midwest and Great Plains, entire communities have withered into what might be called modern ghost town farms. These are not single abandoned farmhouses, but clusters of them, whole neighborhoods where silence reigns and fields stretch unbroken by the signs of human habitation. The decline of small-scale agriculture and the migration of younger generations to urban centers have left behind pockets of emptiness that feel as though entire towns have vanished. Driving through these regions, one encounters roads lined with shuttered homes, collapsing barns, and rusted mailboxes. The churches that once rang with Sunday hymns now sit boarded up, their steeples leaning. Schools, once central to rural life, stand empty with playgrounds overtaken by weeds. It is not just houses that are abandoned, but entire ways of life. Economic forces explain much of this transformation. As industrial agriculture expanded, small family farms could no longer compete. Corporations bought up land, consolidating operations and leaving fewer families to work the same acreage. Jobs vanished, and with them, the need for communities to support large populations. Young people, seeing little future in farming, departed for cities, seeking education and employment. The result is a hollowing out of the countryside, where only the elderly remain, and even they eventually leave or pass away. These modern ghost town farms evoke a different kind of melancholy than isolated abandoned houses. There is scale here, a collective emptiness. Streets that once hosted parades and fairs now host only silence. The echo of absence feels stronger when multiplied by dozens of homes, each with its own story of departure. The effect is not unlike walking through ancient ruins, remnants of a civilization that once thrived, now overtaken by time. Some towns attempt revival. Local governments and historical societies sometimes restore key buildings, hoping to attract tourism. Heritage festivals celebrate the memory of what once was, drawing crowds for a weekend, but rarely reversing the long-term decline. A few communities reinvent themselves as artist colonies or niche agricultural hubs, but these are exceptions. For most, the trajectory is final: abandonment leading to decay, decay leading to disappearance. Modern technology has made these ghost towns more visible than ever. Drone footage captures sweeping views of collapsing neighborhoods, while photographers document the haunting symmetry of empty streets. Online, images of these places circulate widely, drawing fascination from people who may never set foot in rural America. The sight of a row of empty houses or a deserted main street resonates as both eerie and symbolic. It speaks to fears of decline, loss of community, and the fragility of the American dream. There are also cultural consequences. As these farms and towns vanish, so too do the traditions and stories tied to them. Oral histories fade without successors to pass them on. Cemeteries fall into neglect, headstones tilting as the ground swallows them. Folk music, dialects, and local customs risk being forgotten, their context erased along with the buildings that once sheltered them. In this way, the ghost town farm is not just a physical phenomenon, but a cultural one. For those who visit, the experience is profound. Standing in the middle of an empty main street, surrounded by silence, one cannot help but feel the weight of impermanence. These places remind us that communities, like individuals, have lifespans. They are born, they flourish, and eventually, they die. What remains is memory and the haunting presence of structures slowly returning to the earth. Yet even in this decline, there's strange resilience. Wildflowers bloom where children once played. Birds nest in the eaves of collapsing barns. Deer wander freely through fields once plowed by tractors. The land, in its quiet way, adapts. And in the imagination of those who witness it, these ghost town farms take on new life as symbols, as stories, as reminders of both fragility and endurance. Modern ghost town farms are not just relics of economic shifts. They are mirrors reflecting broader patterns of change in America. They show us what is lost when people move on, but also what endures when they do. And as long as these empty farmhouses and towns remain standing, they will continue to speak silent, haunting, and unforgettable. Legacy of fear and memory. The abandoned farmhouse, standing silent in the fields, is more than just a decaying structure, it is a symbol. Its presence carries with it the weight of memory, the residue of lives once lived, and the echoes of stories that continue to resonate. In the end, the legacy of these houses is not only about loss, but also about what they reveal about fear, history, and the fragility of human endeavor. Fear is at the heart of the farmhouse's cultural significance. Part of this fear is primal, the unease of isolation, the uncertainty of what lurks in the shadows, the claustrophobia of endless cornfields. But part of it is also existential. These houses remind us of mortality, of the impermanence of even the most solid-seeming lives. Families built them with the intention of permanence, yet time reduced them to ruins. To stand in front of one is to confront the unsettling truth that everything we build will one day fade. At the same time, the farmhouse embodies memory. Objects left behind: a rusted bed frame, a cracked photograph, a book frozen on a shelf carry the weight of those who lived there. These artifacts transform the houses into vessels of remembrance, repositories of both personal and collective history. Each abandoned room is like a page torn from a family's story, scattered yet enduring. Visitors sense this, which is why even strangers feel such a strong emotional response when entering. The legacy is also cultural. Abandoned farmhouses have become icons of rural America, appearing in films, literature, music, and photography. They symbolize not only fear, but also nostalgia, the longing for a way of life that has vanished. In this sense, they are paradoxical. They repel us with their emptiness while drawing us in with their history. They are reminders of both failure and endurance. For descendants, the legacy is personal. A farmhouse collapsing into the ground is more than a ruin. It is a marker of family heritage slipping away. Cemeteries nearby may still hold the names of those who built it, but the house itself fades with each passing season. This dual loss of both physical structure and living tradition underscores the fragility of memory when not actively preserved. Yet the farmhouse also endures in the imagination. Ghost stories, horror films, and local legends breathe new life into these ruins, ensuring they remain present in cultural consciousness. Even when the last board has fallen, the idea of the abandoned farmhouse will live on. It has become an archetype, a shorthand for fear, memory, and the uncanny. Few other structures carry such weight across both reality and imagination. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of the farmhouse's legacy is the way it blurs the boundary between history and myth. The facts of why a family left may be mundane: economic hardship, foreclosure, migration. But in the absence of certainty, the imagination supplies darker or more poignant explanations. Fact and fiction intermingle until the house becomes something larger than either, a vessel for the hopes, fears, and stories of an entire culture. As we conclude this journey through the cornfield horrors, one truth emerges. The abandoned farmhouse is never truly empty. It is filled with memory, with echoes, with possibility. It challenges us to confront the impermanence of our own lives and to reflect on what we leave behind. In their silence, these houses speak, and what they say is both haunting and profound. The legacy of fear and memory ensures that the farmhouse will remain with us, whether standing in the fields, captured in a photograph, or conjured in a story. Even as nature reclaims them, they endure in imagination. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson, that though we fade, the stories we inspire never truly die.